All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Emily Silence. I'm the Development Associate at Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Today we're going to be talking about acid mine drainage in the North Potomac. And just a little housekeeping before we get started. I do have everyone muted right now, obviously just the easiest way. Feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box. We will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to type them throughout. That way, as you're thinking it, you can write it down and I'll go through at the end. So a little bit about Potomac Riverkeeper Network. If you're not as familiar with us, we are a network of 3 riverkeepers. So a riverkeeper is an individual who protects the river or the bay or whatever body of water it may be. It's a global movement. Our 3 riverkeepers are Brent in the Upper Potomac, Dean in the Lower Potomac, and Mark in the Shenandoah. So like I said, we work to protect the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers and their tributaries through advocacy and through legal means, through litigation as well too. So we work really hard to enforce clean water laws in our watershed. We have lots of programs as well too, from water quality monitoring to river cleanups, what have you. So feel free to type any questions about the organization as well too. I can respond to those. So why don't we get started? Brent Walls is our Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. He's going to be talking to you today. He has lots of experience on the Upper Potomac. He's been with us for several years. He has lots of experience in drones and technology. He really utilizes that to enforce our clean water laws. So Brent, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone for your lunchtime entertainment here. So this intro slide here is actually Georges Creek. It's just downstream from the Barton lime doser, and this was my first tour of acid mine drainage in the North Branch Potomac way back when I started in 2009, and Ed Merrifield gave me a tour up there. So it's been a long time that we've been kind of looking at this and working on this, so we're going to take it away here. So for today, I'm going to talk real quick about what is acid mine drainage, the longevity of mining impacts, a real quick brief history. I know that there's probably a lot of history buffs out there that may know a whole lot more than I do, but this is just going to be a general overview of the history. We're going to talk real quick about the differences between active and passive treatment, which is the 2 main methods for treating acid mine drainage. Example success stories, just a couple of them really, and then future concerns about the life of Jennings Randolph Dam, and of course federal funding. We're going to talk about our acid mine drainage monitoring project that we have been actively working on this year, and then some of our next steps. So here's our some of the resources that are really great out there that I've used for this PowerPoint and have been, really influential in understanding acid mine drainage and how things are working in the North Branch Potomac. So ICPRB has put out a lot of materials in looking at the Jennings Randolph Dam and water quality monitoring in the North Branch. Then we have downstream strategies that put together a great, PDF on the benefits of acid mine drainage, which really dives into the economics of the bounce back that the North Branch has gone through. Earthworks put out a great kind of tutorial about acid mine drainage and worldwide and just the generalities and how it works and how it happens. And then you got the history of the North Branch there. So what is acid mine drainage? Well, essentially, it is the result of mine shafts and active surface mining where there's a lot of sulfides in with the minerals that have been mined. And when that sulfide mixes with oxygen and water, it creates that sulfuric acid. The sulfuric acid is highly acidic. We're talking pHs of 3 And that highly acidic water easily dissolves any of the heavy metals that are in with those minerals. Most of the mining that's been done in the North Branch Potomac has been for coal, but there's a lot of other minerals that are mixed in with that coal. And so the sulfuric acid dissolves those metals and then it discharges. And, it's essentially fish are swimming in battery acid water for many parts of the North Branch way back in the day. That creates toxic metals at levels that are detrimental to fish and macroinvertebrates. So it kills off all the bugs that the fish eat. And so you have no food source for the fish, along with actually, harming the fish's ability to even survive in the water. And in fact, it also does impact plants in and around the stream aquatic environment. So it does a lot of damage. And the longevity of my impacts, this is something from Earthworks. They did a look at mining worldwide. Acid mine drainage has been going on for a very long time. You can even see the little blurb there that Roman mine 2,000 years ago is still delivering acid mine drainage from that mine. And so we have in our midst perpetual impacts from mining that's going to last for hundreds of years. And what that also means too is whenever there's any kind of geological movements as well, tectonic actions, sedimentation shifts, these new fissures can open up in and around the mine shafts, redisturb, expose new minerals, and that is going to interact with the water and the air and deliver even more pH. And so that's why it's a constant maintenance of these treatment systems that we're putting in place, not just here in the North Branch, but worldwide. And it's not just for mine shafts and underground mines, but even surface mines. So when you have surface mines, mountaintop removal, and the mine tailings are put in ravines and then buried, those mine tailings are also going to be a source of acid mine drainage. So it's not just buried, or it's not just mine shafts deep in the earth, but it can also be surface mines as well. So a little history for the North Branch Potomac. Doing some research on this, it was kind of interesting. I learned quite a bit just actually doing some historical research. But the big vein, there's a lot of material about the big vein that opened up in the 1820s. And that big vein is a whole huge amount of coal that was discovered. And back in the day, that coal was loaded onto flatbeds and floated down the Potomac. One of the main companies back in that time period was Georgia Creek Coal and Iron Company, which in fact they're still around, to be honest. They were the big company. They were the ones that discovered the ability, or were the first ones to produce pig iron from bituminous coal. They used the Laneconing iron furnace, which you can see there in the picture is still present. And so they were a huge fixture in the history of mining. They've bought up thousands and thousands of acres. But when the railroad came through in 1842, it just opened things up. The railroad came up into Cumberland, and then you had a lot of other rail lines that spread out from Cumberland into the upper reaches of the upper North Branch Potomac. And it just really exposed and allowed for coal to be distributed down to the ports. And you can see some coal production and how it's fluctuated and increased over time from 1865 to 1900 to 1907, up to 6 million short tons. There was a downturn in 1920s just because it was reflecting the economy and coal at that time. And another note of interest that I saw is that during all that time, there were a lot of smaller companies that were staking their claims to coal. But in 1945, there was a large consolidation of all those smaller coal companies. And so you only had a few large ones that were operating. So the impacts of the North Branch Potomac, they've been seen for a very, very long time, but they weren't necessarily measured, not until we get into the 1960s, where pH was consistently below 4.5 throughout much of the North Branch Potomac. And you can see here in 1969, a pH of 2.3, seriously acidic in the river at Steyr. So 45 miles of North Branch Potomac, 100 miles of tributaries, virtually no aquatic fauna. And I've talked to a lot of people in my time as riverkeeper, and I get the same story. So many people considered the North Branch Potomac dead for such a long time. It was pretty much a waste pit. No one swam in it, no one caught fish in it, and it was just one of those things you ignored. It was there, it was an orange river, and it was just a source, an eyesore, and a problem. So, which is really unfortunate because it's such a beautiful area, and to have a stream with no life is just a waste. So, in 1970, though, the construction of Jennings Randolph Dam Lake begins. See here this old picture. This is actually a mining operation that was at the base of, or the bottom of, where Jennings Randolph Lake is today. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Then, of course, 1972, the Clean Water Act came out. 1976, pH at 4.5 in Bloomington is lower than the state standard. So the state, Maryland, was actually, trying to push forward and trying to develop mechanisms and understanding of what's going on with the acid mine drainage in the North Branch Potomac. But that change for the North Branch Potomac really didn't kick off until the 1977 with SMACRA. And, I know that a lot of folks understand what that is. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, it set rules for current mines and basically a federal tax system that would pay for acid mine drainage treatment. And so that's a little bit of money coming in from the federal government into the state governments so that they can issue and develop programs to address the mining. And so finally, some funds were coming in that could start to address acid mine drainage. But, in 1981, the Jennings Randolph Lake was completed, and things really started to happen from then on. Cooperative agreement between West Virginia and Maryland to really develop a plan for acid mine drainage abatement occurred in 1987. And then you start to see some changes. You start to see some improvements in the North Branch Potomac. Stocks of trout were going in Barnum. You have natural reproduction in the early 90s of trout in the lower North Branch Potomac. One of the first dosers was installed at Kitzmiller. And then from that point on, you just had an explosion of projects that were being considered and put into place in the Upper North Branch Potomac. So what are these projects? What kind of treatment technologies were utilized? And there's really two main types of treatment technologies. One is a passive treatment, and this essentially requires a large area. You have the abandoned mine land, you have the drainage point of origin where the acid water is coming out, and you have to have a series of different ponds to reduce the pH, bring it back up to more of a neutral pH. And what that does, when you neutralize the acidic water, it precipitates out the heavy metals, and it precipitates that out in these various different ponds in the passive treatment system. Then at the end of this series of ponds, then you would have water with a limited amount of metals and water that's at a neutral pH. Here's an example at the Kempton mines, one of the passive treatments. This is before, and then this is after. And so you can see it takes a considerable area for a passive treatment. And you don't necessarily always have large tracts of land to be able to treat passively. There is less maintenance required for these, but there still is maintenance. But then there's active treatment, and active treatment has been probably by far the more popular route to go, especially since a lot of our acid mine drainage sites are in small rough terrain, not a lot of area, and you're able to pop these dosers in at a site close to the source. And essentially what it does is it has a powdered form of lime that's measured according to the amount of pH of the water. So the more acidic of the water is, and the volume of that water is then calculated to figure out the amount of powdered lime that's dropped into a channel, and that delivers that neutralization of the pH more to a close to a 7, and that precipitates immediately the metals. And you can see here, this is the precipitate in the metals that occur right after a lime dosing. This is at the Barton Mine, and that runs into Georges Creek. And then this is the downstream from that small tributary that goes into Georges Creek. Now, what was interesting about this one is, and this is why I brought up earlier, the geological impacts and the longevity of these acid mine drainage problems is, I think it was during my time as Riverkeeper, and there was a geological shift in that Barton Mine complex, and there was an increase of pH. So because that shift cracked some more fissures in the mines, exposed more minerals, the acidity went up, the amount of water had increased, and so the lime dosing wasn't significant enough, wasn't appropriate for the amount of acid and water that was coming out of that mine after that shift. And so that's why these mine dosers have to be constantly monitored. They have to be, you have to fill the dosers up with lime. You have to be out there measuring the pH on a regular basis, and you have to be out there assessing the volume on, very, very often. So that way you can maintain these dosers and maintain the water quality and adjustments that it does. So some of the benefits of lime dosers, downstream strategies. It's a great report. Everyone should read it. It really kind of dived into not only the water quality benefits, and you can see there in the left-hand side there some of the benefits pre and post doser, but the economic benefits are just incredible. I mean, for the $300,000 to $400,000 for maintaining these dosers on a yearly basis, you have a significant amount of annual local economic benefit. I mean, with the bounce back of the the North Branch Potomac, recreational fishing occurs. People are out there, whitewater rafting. So there's a lot of people that are staying out there, bed and breakfasts, spending money in those areas. And so that all directly relates to how the river is improving. And when we talk about Upper Potomac, we can't forget about talking about the Kempton Mine complex, because this is an enormous mine that is at the very top, the headwaters of our North Branch Potomac. And in fact, it covers 2 different watersheds. And so it's just a huge complex. And, this is one of the main mine shafts on the Maryland side where the complex discharges millions of gallons every day. And here's one of the main dosers from the Kempton Mine aerial view from the drone that I flew. This was about a year or so ago. And so you can see the amount of precipitated out metals in that pool right below where that mine shaft is, or where the doser is, and then into that pond. And so it's a constant maintenance nightmare to try and make sure that the water quality continually improves in the North Branch Potomac. Then we get to the Jennings Randolph Dam, and like in the history, when I was going through that, the Jennings Randolph Dam really was a game changer. It really helped become a influencing factor in how the North Branch Potomac below the dam improved so rapidly. As you can see here, placement wise, you have a considerable amount of river and acid mine drainage areas above the dam. Dam and lake is right there in the middle of your screen. And then from Barnum all the way down to Kaiser and even all the way down to Pinto, in that area, just things improved dramatically, really, really fast. And, that really is essentially due to the fact that the lake acts as a pH capacitor. You have acidic water, even though you have some lime dosers and passive treatment above Jennings Randolph Lake, it still acts as a capacitor, and it neutralizes any potential acidic water that's coming in. And then you have the dam that has this cylinder that goes into the depths of the water that can alter what level of the stream or of the lake that they're going to import water and then discharge. It's so every lake has stratification, temperature stratifications of the water, and so the dam can pull in water at deeper depths, colder water, and then discharge that through the system. And the discharge ports were all made out of stainless steel to compensate for the potential acidity that they might encounter and really provide some longevity. But there are some problems with the dam, and there are some future issues that really, really need to be considered. Because it is a pH capacitor, and you have still a lot of sediments and metals that are coming into the system that are attached to all the sediments. And, we have a dam system, we have a lake system that is over time going to eventually fill in. And after a while, that sediment sink, that metal sink, is going to produce and be a liability for the stream, for the North Branch Potomac, eventually down the road. And so that's something that needs to be considered. That's something that needs to be thought about. And I know that's why the ICPRB and other groups are looking at trying to develop a holistic management plan for the entire North Branch Potomac that includes dosers, that includes passive treatment, includes a better understanding of the longevity of the Jennings Randolph Lake and dam, and just try and figure out what's the best way to in perpetuity preserve the North Branch Potomac and continue the water quality improvements that have been occurring. So again, acid mine drainage treatment is really essentially a Band-Aid. Constant maintenance. Another thing to consider too is there's surface property rights, and so you have these abandoned mine lands and that are once foregone abandoned mineral rights, and then you have surface property rights. And so trying to convince surface property owners to put up lime dosers or to put in a passive treatment system can be very daunting for the state agency to try and get that conducted or get that finished. And then there's the federal funds. I'm not going to be talking a whole lot about the federal funds. That's something that definitely needs to be kind of dived into a whole lot more in detail. But essentially in 2022 seems to be this marker of when federal funds from SMACRA are going to run out. And if that happens, then federal funding that goes to the states to help for AMD treatment is going to die away. And if we don't have a replacement for those funds, or if we don't have some kind of funding that is coming from the state to support this acid mine drainage treatment, then we're really going to have a reversal of conditions in the North Branch Potomac. So, having funding that is dedicated in perpetuity for treatment of acid mine drainage is essential. And that's something that I think we'll continue to work on. We'll continue to push for at the legislative session or the federal session. So it's definitely something that we know needs to continue to occur. And so, this brings us to what is Potomac Riverkeeper doing? what I wanted to do, this is a couple of years ago, I was trying to think of how do I get involved? How do I get involved in figuring out what to do with acid mine drainage? And, what I wanted to do is not necessarily choose a site and say, hey, let's get some funding and do some passive treatments. But I really wanted to understand a little bit more about acid mine drainage. I want to understand what kind of monitoring is going on out there. And what we realized is that there's a lot of smaller streams that are flowing into the North Branch Potomac that aren't necessarily monitored on a regular basis. There may be some sporadic monitoring done by the state or by USGS or EPA, but it's not consistent and it's not long term, and it's not looking at dry and wet weather events. And so that's what we wanted to do. So we set out in this monitoring program for the Upper North Branch. We're going to look at smaller tributaries for acid mine drainage pollution. We're going to identify any AML or abandoned mine lands or active surface mining impacts, hopefully. And then, some of the data that we would bring from this could be potentially used for 8303D listings in the impaired waters list. So we looked at field data. We're doing temperature, pH, conductivity, and dissolved oxygen. And in the lab, we really had to kind of narrow down what we wanted to test for. I mean, there's a whole list of potential things that we can do, but when we're collecting samples twice a month from March to November, that's a whole lot of monitoring and that's a whole lot of money. So we really had to pare down to some of the essentials. And so we chose aluminum, manganese, and iron. Those seems to be the trigger points. And there's some water quality standards that go along with those. Those seem to be more prevalent when there is acid mine drainage issues. And so that's what we chose. The sites that we look at are here in the Upper North Branch Potomac. So this is just down from the Kempton Mine complex. In the Maryland side, we're looking at the Upper Laurel Run, and then a small tributary that runs into that Laurel Run watershed system that crosses Kempton Road. We have the Sand Run, Shields Run, a small little tributary that crosses Corona Bayard Road. So those were all in Maryland. And then on the West Virginia side, we are looking at Buffalo Creek, an unnamed small tributary. This other unnamed tributary number 2 is actually Red Oak Creek. And so that's been renamed Red Oak Creek for our monitoring purposes. And then also in West Virginia, Elk Run and Deacon Run. So those are the sites that we have. Our wonderful Catherine, who is a Hood College graduate student. We have some good donations that came in to help support her time to go up there twice a month and collect these samples, the field samples, and collect water samples and take them to the lab, which we are using in Fredericktown Lab. And I want to give a great big shout out to Fredericktown Labs because they have supported our program with a incredible donation of all the sampling that we're doing for this year free of charge. And that's a considerable donation, a considerable amount of money that they've given us to be able to support this project. So we're extremely fortunate for their help in this. So one of the things that we looked at before we were sampling is we wanted to look at what streams are out there that are on the 303D list of impaired waters. And so it's just kind of taking a real quick look. In West Virginia, we have Buffalo Creek and Elk Run, both with iron on the impaired waters list for iron, and then Buffalo Creek for aluminum. In Maryland, Laurel Run and Sand Run were the 2 main tributaries that have specific aluminum and iron and manganese and various different metals on the impaired waters list. But we also knew that the main stem of the Upper North Branch just had a whole host of problems. And so that's why we didn't really necessarily want to sample the main stem. We already knew that there were issues. We wanted to find out what issues have not been captured by previously monitoring from different states and other agencies. So then we also looked at water quality standards. when we're trying to figure out which ones that we wanted to identify to sample for. And this will also help us to, when we present the data, to suggest if a site should be listed in 303D list for either iron, manganese, or aluminum. In West Virginia, they do have standards for iron, manganese, and aluminum. Maryland, I didn't see any numeric standards. However, they do have several of the streams that are listed for some of those same parameters as on the 303D list. So I would assume that they're still following the EPA methodology and EPA water quality standards. So 1,000 micrograms per liter for iron. And aluminum is a little bit different. So there's a new proposed limit that's by EPA that's out there for comment right now. And you can see in the chart there, in 1988, we had 750 micrograms per liter in fresh water for acute issues, 87 micrograms per liter for chronic issues. And then now we have a huge range that's being proposed. So, 1 to 4,800 micrograms per liter, 0.63 to 3,200 micrograms per liter. So that's a significant range. And that all has to do with trying to, understand the factors in time, pH, dissolved organic carbon, and hardness. And so all those are going to have to play into the calculation for each and every site. So it's confusing, but it's definitely something that we're going to have to work on. So we're going to dive into some field data and kind of moving through on this PowerPoint pretty fast here. But so here's the some of the field data that is, we have conductivity and pH. So they're mostly focusing on in this slide set. You can see the huge spike in conductivity. SR is sand run. And that's been fairly consistent, and that's understandable too, because it is on the 303D list for manganese and iron. So you are going to have fairly high consistent conductivity coming from sand run. But we also have the DR is Deacon Creek, and then BC is Buffalo Creek, and so we also have some signatures there. But I also want to point you to the pH. Actually, no, the conductivity. So we look at the conductivity. Kempton Road, KR. Everything seems to be fairly good, but then it spikes up at the very end of this set of this data set here. And then you look over to the pH. Most of the sites are relatively above 7. Now the ULR, Upper Laurel Run, that's expected. Because the site that we're collecting the sample from is just upstream from the current lime doser that is in operation. And so that's expected to have those more acidic waters right there. But what was not expected is the KR Kempton Road crossing in Laurel Run, where you have a huge spike, or I should say a dip in pH. It went all the way down to a 4 at about the same time that we had a spike in conductivity. Now, what we're theorizing is this was in line with a rain event that occurred in that area. And just upstream, it's not very far, but just upstream from the Kempton Road crossing is the gob pile of Mentiki coal. And you can see at the base, the gob pile is where the stormwater ponds are. Now, apparently there are injection wells where they pump this leachate runoff into, but we're also suspect to what might else be happening. Or it could be the fact that you have a lot of legacy pollutants in that section of the stream, that whenever it rains, it exposes those sediments and delivers a pulse of pollution. And so that's essentially what we were trying to gather with this monitoring data. We're trying to understand dry weather, wet weather, and what's happening from these smaller streams. So then we take a look at some of the lab data. So we have, now this is in milligrams per liter, and you have to really understand the differences between milligrams per liter and micrograms per liter, which is most of the standards. So 1 milligram per liter is 1,000 micrograms per liter. And so, in most of the standards, except for manganese, or no, aluminum, where you have it where it's around 750 micrograms per liter, or 0.75 milligrams per liter. So what we have here is Niagara Run, which is, there was some snow melt in the beginning of our sampling period, which may contribute to the higher levels of aluminum, iron, and manganese, but it tapered off and has been relatively low. Same thing with the unnamed tributary, but then some differences with Corona Bayard Road and Buffalo Creek. And now Buffalo Creek, we expected the iron and the aluminum, because they are listed on the 303D list. And those spikes, the spikes are kind of interesting. They're not necessarily in line with a rain event. We had more rain towards the end of this data set that's being shown right now. And so that spike that happened in the beginning, it could be due to snow melt. I'm not exactly sure. So that's of an interest to us. But the Corona Bayard Road was actually very interesting. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot upriver from this monitoring site, yet in the beginning it was relatively low, and then we started getting some significant signatures: iron, aluminum, and some manganese. And it seems like it coincides with the increased amount of rain events that we've had during that time period. So we're gonna see what happens in the rest of August and in September, because we've had a whole lot more rain. So when that data comes in, we'll have to take a look at that specifically to see if it continues to amp up during rain events. But the other thing to note too is the Corona Bayard Road site is not listed for any metals. I think it is listed for salts, like much of the tributaries that are connected on the Maryland side to the North Branch Potomac. And then continuing on with some of the sites, Deacon Run, it was a little bit interesting. Deacon Run, I don't see, looking at my notes real quick. Deacon Run had some spikes in iron, but I don't believe Deacon Run is listed for iron on the 303D list. So that piqued our interest. Sand Run, we understand iron and aluminum are in manganese, or no, iron and manganese are definitely on the 303D list. And so we expected some higher levels in Sand Run. Elk Run also, I think, is on the 303D list for iron. So, we're expected to see some of those levels. Red Oak was a little bit different, but is also kind of similar to some of the other sites where you have some higher levels in the beginning, maybe due to snow melt, and then it kind of bounces around, but no significant spikes during rain events. So here's the Kempton Road one. Remember, we talked about the pH and the conductivity going up here more recently. And so at the same time as the drop in pH and the spike in conductivity, we have a significant increase in aluminum and a slow increase in iron, and actually a little bit of increase in manganese. So we're very, very concerned about that particular one. And I know that the complex is, that whole area of Upper Laurel Run is on the 303D list for much of these. But what's interesting is seeing how this might be a response to weather events. And as you can see there, Upper Laurel Run, again, the sampling site is just above the Lime Doser. And so we would expect to see some of those. I think what would be great is to be able to compare the sample site that we have to samples that are below the lime doser. So it'd be interesting if the state does have some data for monitoring below the lime doser, and we can do some comparison. So that'd be a lot of fun to kind of look at that. Shields Run, we have a limited number of data points for Shields Run because we had to abandon our monitoring site at Shields Run due to some aggravated property owners in that area. So it was not so safe to have someone out there collecting samples twice a month due to property owners. But the limited data that we did have really didn't have a whole lot of significant issues that we saw. It still had a signature for acid mine drainage, but it's not as significant as some of the others. So, some basic conclusions right now from the data so far. Again, we still have a few months to go, and not all the data is recorded here. But the tributaries that have a 303D listing is tracking it as expected. I mean, we would see the higher conductivity, would see the lower pH, you would see some of the elevated levels of metals. So that is, that is tracking, and so that it's understandable. Most of, if not all, the streams are still contributing to acid mine drainage to the North Branch Potomac. The Corona Bayard Road site is of interest to us because it has not been previously listed for iron, aluminum, or manganese, and we're fairly certain that our data could be used to show that it needs to be listed on the 303D list. And then again, talking about the Kempton Road site, should possibly be listed for manganese. It is not at this point in time, but we did get a spike, and so we'll continue to look at the data as we move throughout the rest of the monitoring period to see if we're going to continue to see more manganese spikes. But that is of significant interest to us as well. So what are the next steps for our program? And, we're going to continue to gather data through November. We would like to be able, once we have all that data together, present it to MDE and DEP, just to see how we can kind of work together on some on understanding and maybe developing this holistic way of protecting the upper parts of the North Branch and the North Branch as a whole. We'd like to use our data to be used as a 303D listing for some of these smaller streams. And, we'd like to investigate upstream of some of the current sampling sites that we have right now to identify any possible sources. Is it an old mine shaft? Is it current active mining and mine tailings? Is it inadequate stormwater ponds from either remediated sites or active sites that are just not working the way they should be working? So there's a lot of things to consider. And then for next year, what we'd like to do, if we can get the same support as what we've had this year, is we'd like to move down the watershed a little bit from Gorman to Jennings Randolph Lake and do basically the same kind of monitoring. Select some sites from the smaller tributaries and test twice a month from March to November. So that's something that we're planning on. So we'll just have to see if the cards play out for us. And then last but not least, I'd like to again say thank you to Fredericktown Labs for really helping us with this project. And without their support, it just would not have been possible for the entire year. And then Hood College, they've been great in working with us and the grad student program and lending us some extra hands to collect these samples. So I think with that, I am finished and I am open for questions.
All right, awesome. We had a few questions come in as people registered, so I'm going to ask those first.
Sure.
So first question, curious what IR signature such acidity has relative to background multispectral cameras. I'm using your DJI for a prop and some rescue work tool fabrication, which I hope to do with first responders.
A lot of good questions. I would love to be able to, and I know who that is, Mike. Yes, Mike, I know that that's probably from you. I would love to be able to fly a drone and try and get some multispectral imaging just to see if we could see something new that we haven't seen before. So I am game for a project, dude. So anytime, let's do it.
Next question. What about heavy water originating from landfills?
Heavy water originating from landfills. Yeah, I mean, so we have landfills and we have injection wells. We have a lot of action that's going on up there that is interplaying and intermixing with the acid mine drainage that is current. And so it's really trying to suspect and understand all of that. I'm not too up on where these locations are of heavy water and in those locations. And so that's, so we're doing our small part, but I want to be a part of the team that ICPRB is putting together to develop this holistic. And that's obviously something that we need to roll into this and understand how it impacts everything else in that area.
Okay, great. Next question. Do they only use one type of lime in the dozers?
That's a good question. I think some of my state folks are going to be here on the call. Maybe they can answer that, but I would imagine, it might be similar to the same lime that's being put on the farm fields to bring the pH back up to more neutral so your crops can grow better. So whether it's from one source, I'm not exactly sure. I just know from them that is a real challenge to get these dosers filled with lime, especially where these doses are located. It's just a real challenge. It's very, very maintenance intensive.
Okay. How can the funds from the recently passed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act be leveraged to fund long-term solutions for our region?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there are a lot of plans on the books. I know that the MDE mine program, and I would imagine as well as the West Virginia DEP mining program, they have a lot of locations that they know of that need to be addressed. It's just a matter of money to address those projects. It's also a matter of trying to get permissions from landowners to address those projects. And and so it's just a constant money driven, and I'm hoping that funds through that process can help the states implement some of these projects that I know that are on the books.
Great. So another question on policy. So I know that Good Samaritan legislation has been introduced in the Senate. This would establish a pilot program to allow nonprofit or other groups to try and improve water quality from hard rock mines without assuming liability for the entire cleanup. While the current legislation targets Western hard rock mines, would a similar program assist the UPRB?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, I know that there's considerable amount of interest in the Western mines and the Western side of the states, but yeah, I think, and if is that something that that Potomac Riverkeeper Network would embark on? Possibly. We got a lot on our plate with wastewater treatment plants and CSOs and farming and other pollution sources, and acid mine drainage is definitely on our list, but it may not be in our wheelhouse. But we'll see. I mean, if the opportunity is there and the funds are ripe, it could be something that we can be involved in. But again, I think that really needs to be looked at holistically, how we need to accomplish that. Because remember, we have this longevity that we need to think about. We need to think about how can we maintain the water quality in the North Branch Potomac for the long haul, and how do we do that? So.
Thanks, Brent. Another question, will there be a report published after the monitoring season wraps up?
Oh yeah, I definitely hope so. We'll have, I know that Catherine has done a vlog on her monitoring out there, and we'll definitely have all the data and all the results and produce a report that we'll put out there, and then we'll be able to present that information to the states and publicly. When that's going to happen, not exactly sure. Probably, early part of 2023.
Next question. Are there any signs of gaining or losing segments interactions with groundwater at any of your sites?
That's a really good question. I haven't really seen a whole lot of that. Again, we're just in these, we're right at the mouth of many of these small streams before they enter into the main stem of the North Branch Potomac. So we're not really going too far up in the rivers. I would love to be able to ask that same question of Maryland DNR, which in fact was interesting. I came across some DNR folks doing a fish survey in Upper Laurel Run, and in fact they were right there at that Kempton Road mine site that we collect samples from. And so they would be the ones, since they're boots on the ground and trudging through the stream, up and down the streams looking for trout and signs of other fish and aquatic life. They might be able to answer that question better than I.
Next question, what's the linkage between conditions upstream of JRL and the long-term water quality downstream? i.e., can we have a healthy lower Potomac without addressing the headwater impairments? Given the Potomac is the drinking water supply of 6 million people and empties into the Chesapeake.
Yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing right now. I mean, we have been doing some dosers and treatment, acid mine drainage treatment. A lot more needs to be done upriver from Jennings Randolph Dam, but we really have to have both. We have to have a holistic take on this, because the less we focus on upstream of Jennings Randolph Dam is going to eventually make the lake obsolete and its ability to protect downstream. And so we really have to look at this in a holistic view and figure out how much time do we have before sediment becomes too much of an infill in the lake and the dam operation is limited, and then becomes a liability. It becomes a toxic source of pollution. So we really need to have a better understanding from the Army Corps on that, and have this holistic approach to figuring how we can maintain water quality at the Potomac.
All right. I think that was the last question, unless anyone has any other last minute ones. We'll allow people to unmute themselves if they have kind of a last question that they want to ask.
Okay.
Other than that, I think we'll end it there. Brent.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Again, my email address is brent@potomacriverkeeper.org. Give me a shout out if you needed ask some more additional questions. Again, hopefully we'll have this data together in a nice report first thing in 2023. So I look forward to sharing all of our data with you all.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys for joining. We appreciate it.
Yep. Have a good rest of your day.